Okay, I'm a little self-conscious about this, but I want to just open up with a personal story. One of the wonderful things about having children is you get to see the world through the eyes of somebody who isn't used to all the stuff that you're seeing yet. My youngest son, Gabe, when he was about 3 years old, I was holding him in my arms one night. We walked out the door. I live in Santa Barbara, maritime fog, lots of time. The coast faces south. We don't get very spectacular sunsets, but this one was amazing. It was just a fire of sun colors up to the horizon, and I think it was the first sunset that Gabe saw. And his eyes widened like saucers, and then he turned to me with shaking lips and a quivering voice, and he said, "Daddy, look, God painted the sky." It was a tough moment for me because I had to say to him, "Gabe, that's stupid. God had nothing to do with it. It's just a differential refraction of light." Of course, I did not say that. I entered into Gabe's moment of worship, and with the confidence that as he grew up and decided for himself what to think about God, if he learned the laws of optics, he could just see them as God's brushes. Now, here's the point, I guess most people would expect me to say, yeah, that's what evolution is. It's God's brushes. But it's not quite that simple, because sometimes a scientific theory, the brush strokes themselves, can conflict with what we believe about the world from other sources, from Scripture, or even from our deepest moral intuitions. And I think evolutionary theory in particular, there are lots of questions that it raises, but in particular, our understanding of what it means to be human is in tension with how that theory is most prominently represented. This isn't just a Christian nervousness that from the time of Darwin up until the present day. By the way, Darwin walked very carefully on this issue, but many of his chief advocates didn't. So across the channel, let me get this started. In Germany, Karl Vogt said, "Man is not a special creation produced in a different way and distinct from other animals, endowed with an individual soul and animated by the breath of God." More recently, my colleague, primatologist Franz de Waal, said, "It's the rare claim of human uniqueness that holds up for more than a decade. We have no basic wants or needs that cannot also be observed in our close relatives." And James Rachel's philosopher, in his book, Created from Animals, The Moral Implications of Darwinism, says, "Darwinism undermines both the idea that man is made in the image of God and the idea that man is a rational being." Now, not everybody recognizes this, but in the U.S., the genesis of the creationist anti-evolution movement, and in fact the core of what's called the monkey trials, was just this. So William Jennings Bryan, the prosecuting attorney, in a New York Times editorial at the time, said, "The only part of evolution which is any considerable interest is evolution applied to man. Evolution applied to fish, birds, beasts would not materially affect man's view of his own responsibilities. But the evolution that's harmful makes man, instead of being made in the image of God, a development of beasts." By the way, Bryan himself, under trial, he wasn't concerned about the age of the earth, but he was concerned about this. And elsewhere, it was concerned not about the erosion of moral responsibility, but the emergence of biological racism, which in many quarters was tied to evolutionary theory. So that's what I want to look at. And I'll tell you in advance, there's lots of philosophical questions here. But I think that the most popular representations of evolutionary theory as being an acid that corrodes any notion of human uniqueness or moral realism, I actually think is a misrepresentation of the theory itself. So my job here is not to convince you to believe in evolution, but just to recognize what current proposals for evolution entail, and then we can think through together the theological entailments. So first of all, why do I think this is important? Why do I think we should think it's important? Well, there's manifold levels of significance. There are historiographic issues. Who were the first humans? How long ago were they? Lots of science has said there's no way that there is a single male and female progenitor in the relatively recent past. Josh Swamidass, in a recent book, and his recent work, has very firmly debunked those claims. But there are also doctrinal questions of the nature of the fall, what it means to be made in the image of God. I almost can't believe this, but in the scientific journal Nature, which is probably the most prestigious journal of science in the world, it opens up with all deference to the sensibilities of religious people, the idea that man was created in the image of God can surely be laid aside. Now, the assumption here, of course, is that number one, being made in the image of God involves some sort of ontological or difference in capacities, and we heard in our first talk today that that's not necessarily true. But the second claim is that there is nothing distinctive about human beings, and that's what I want to dispute here. So lastly, these questions involve beyond Christianity, beyond even biblical monotheism. They involve fundamental moral questions. So the quote that I just shared with you from Rachel's, he goes on to say, the idea of human dignity turns out, therefore, to be the effluvium of a discredited metaphysics. And the philosopher of biology, Michael Roos, and the evolutionary biologist Theo Wilson, who just died recently, say the time has come to take seriously the fact that we're humans are modified monkeys, not the favored creation of a benevolent God on the sixth day. In an important sense, ethics as we understand it is an illusion fobbed off on us by our genes to get us to cooperate. It's without external grounding. So, okay, that's why I'm convinced these issues are important. Just a couple of cautions to begin with. First of all, I'm cautious about theological relinquishment in the face of science. If science seems to be said there's nothing distinctive about human beings, I'm not a theologian, but I'm concerned that theology relinquish any assertion of human difference, even if we understand that the image of God is not based solely on ontological distinctions. It surely would be the case that God endows us to respond to his distinctive call on us. And on the other hand, I'm concerned that we not reject the science because of its entailments, that would be the consequentialist fallacy, or that we do scientific cherry picking to just pick the science that we think fits with where we want to go. And I'll try not to do that. Okay, the other introductory comment is just I want to make some distinctions. And first of all, when we talk about the human, there are not only different construals, but actually there are different domains of discourse. There are different levels of inquiry. So one might just be the biological taxonomic distinction. What is there a human species and what is it? There could be an ontological distinction of does being human involve certain fundamental, distinctive, and essential capacities. By the way, this question might extend the boundary of human beyond human beings. So there's discussion of whether Neanderthals were human or even further back in the Homo phylogeny. And on the other hand, the human could be constrained. And so there's a sad history of biological racism that acknowledged that some Homo sapiens were more human than others. And then lastly, there are theological attributions of the human, which we have heard about this morning. A distinction with Josh Swamidass also brings up. I'm going to be looking at this. And the reason I'm going to look at this is because this may be irresponsible, but I'm thinking of the Supreme Court comment, pornography is, you know it when you see it. I'm not going to try to define humans or deduce it inferentially. I'm just going to say when I look at Homo sapiens, I think they're humans. And now the question is there anything distinctive about them, about us? So one last qualification, whenever you talk about this, there's always this phrase, do we differ in degree or we differ in kind? And I want to suggest, the philosophy of natural kinds is very complicated, but I want to suggest that this is too simplistic, that for some things you could have a difference in degree, like let's say a bell curve, and at the extent of this bell curve, your chances are 1 out of 1,000 of getting some trait that different. But what if we go all the way out here? You could have a radical outlier that was sufficiently different in degree that it's legitimate to call it a difference in kind. In fact, my colleagues, and I count them friends, Hugh Ross and Foz Reyna in their book, Who Was Adam, suggests that's the case with humans. This is a graph of a measure called Encephalization Quotient, and there's a big gap between humans and Homo erectus, for example. Now, we've had interesting conversation about this. I've pointed out that they actually left out Neanderthal, and more recent work suggests a pretty contiguous sequence. But that doesn't mean that there isn't such a thing of so different in degree that you're different in kind, and that's what I want to look at. So there's lots of questions. Do humans are we the only ones that use symbolic conceptualization? These are definitional questions. I just want to look at the straightforward empirical question of do humans do anything that other animals don't? And the interesting thing is within the biosciences right now, there's convergent, emphatic attention to this. The scale of cooperation, which ultimately is related to the telos of love. So in every other animal species we looked at, and cooperation itself is tough because there's always the possibility of defection. So what stabilizes it? In an animal cooperation, it's either kin selection. The biologist J.G.S. Haldane was famous for doodling on a napkin in a pub one night and saying, "Aha, I'll gladly give my life for 2 brothers or 8 cousins." That it makes sense to cooperate with somebody who shares your genes in proportion to the degree of genetic similarity. And by the way, virtually every culture that we've looked at, kinship obligation is an issue, and kinship distance is also evident. But we don't just cooperate with our relatives. We also cooperate with each other, as do other animals. And the second notion is reciprocity. I'll give you a back rub if you give me a back rub. And the fascinating thing about human beings is they do this. We can't say they don't. They do much more than this. In animal species, ultimately, all these forms of cooperation are compensatory with respect to fitness. In human beings, we vastly extend the range beyond relatives and people that we know from reciprocal exchange, and it's not always compensatory. The depth of investment or sacrifice, and this isn't a Jeff Schloss observation, prominent article in the Philosophical Transactions concludes human cooperation exceeds that of all other species with regard to what I just said, the scale and the range of cooperative exchange. In a really seminal paper, reviewing human altruism, Ernst Fehr concludes human altruism is a powerful force and is unique in the animal world. Human societies represent a huge anomaly in the animal world. And other treatments phrase it like a spectacular evolutionary anomaly, orders of magnitude greater than any other species, spectacular outlier with respect to all other animal species. Now look, I know that a quote doesn't prove something's true, but what I want to convey is the consensus in biology and evolutionary theory is not that there's nothing unique about human beings. It's that there is. And at least one of the things that there is this spectacular capacity to invest our lives in the lives of others who aren't just our kin and who aren't just standing to replicate. Okay, one step more. The scale and range of cooperation is unique, but I want to share with you a bit about the context. And that the context I want to put on the table is a relatively new perspective in evolutionary theory called major evolutionary transitions. It's generated a lot of work recently. I first need to tell you what it's not. A major evolutionary transition isn't just some big innovation like a backbone from invertebrates, or eyes, or a nervous system. I mean, those are big breakthroughs. But these major evolutionary transitions are jumps in a thematically consistent direction. Okay, so the one other thing that it's not then, it's a jump. It's not sequential, incremental escalations. I know I'm at a seminary. I may be making a mistake here, not for any religious reasons, but for attention to the audience. But I want to take 1 minute to just show you some recent work on a sequential evolution across biological time. The notion of progress has been viewed as heretical for much of the 20th century, and in many respects, we're coming back to it. So here's a couple of examples. Over evolutionary time, cellular diversity increases. We have more specialist cells doing different things. Metabolic intensity increases. So what does that mean? If you got more specialists equipped to do particular jobs and you got more energy to feed them, you just get better at what living systems do. So homeostatic precision increases. That means your ability to control your body temperature, pH, oxidation of the dialoctate. I just made those words up. In a sense, Paul says in Romans 1, be not conformed to this world. That's an index of spiritual life. It's an index of biological life, too. When you are completely conformed to the world, when your temperature is the world's temperature, when your pH is the world temperature, there's a word for that, and it's called a corpse. And what happens is, over evolutionary time, we've had an increase in the actual qualities of life. I think of Jesus, I come that you might have life and have it more abundantly. I think that's true. I think it's miraculously true, but I also think it's true over the course of God's creative activity in the world. One last little one. This is most recent. The biological clock changes over evolutionary time, and organisms live longer. And with living longer, there's more opportunity to learn. And if you have more opportunity to learn, it makes more evolutionary or sense to invest in the metabolically demanding brain tissue. And all those things happen. Over time, organisms live longer, allocate more to their brains, have a more broad range of behavioral flexibility and problem solving. And we see an increase in parental investment over a longer period of time, which I think relates to the evolution of the capacity for love. In fact, there's a word for this. Ecologists and evolutionary biologists call this a K strategy as opposed to an R strategy. K means long life, more investment, in a fewer number of offspring. So what are the major evolutionary transitions then? Well, they're kind of a union, big jumps and sequential amplification of a particular theme. And here's what the theme is. The theme is the relinquishment of individual autonomy to join a guild of cooperative interdependence. Examples. Now, I want to say whether you think these things happen supernaturally or over a long period of time or a short period of time or naturally over a long period of time, there is in the history of life these transitions. The first cell from independent molecules to a membrane-bound collective. And then prokaryotic, simple cells with no organelles within them, joining to form eukaryotic cells. And then single cells joining together to form multicellular organisms of increasing complexity. And then organisms that can reproduce on their own, committing themselves to needing another one to reproduce. And then solitary organisms committing themselves, not just facultatively, but we have to live together if we're going to make it. And then this one is the one I have to say that surprises me. This is abundant in the secular literature. Primate to human sociality is viewed as a major evolutionary transition. And in this case, not only is the scale of human societies, non-related individuals, bigger than any other species, but it's mediated in a way that no other species mediates sociality. We have what's called extrasomatic storage of information. We have symbols. So, wow. That alone is a difference in kind. So let me sum this up real quick. You have, in these transitions, you have cooperative interdependence. It's not optional. It's obligate cooperative interdependence. You have specialization and dependent division of labor. We have changes in information transmission. I didn't go to that in detail, but it's certainly evident with humans. And we have the relinquishment of reproductive autonomy. So that prokaryotic cell that became an organelle, now the reproduction happens at a larger scale. And all those things come together to achieve what we just talked about earlier, an amplification of biotic capacities. The interesting thing that's happening right now is that, 50 years ago, the Christian and philosopher and chemist Michael Polanyi argued in a paper in Science, the evolutionary sequence gains a new and deeper significance. We can recognize a strictly defined progression rising from inanimate level to ever higher additional principles of life. That was viewed as heretical for many years, and in light of what I just talked about, we've come back to it. So referring to Polanyi, Carl Sagan says, this progress, nowadays described as a series of major transitions, is often due to the emergence of new cooperative units. Now again, the context. Humans are viewed as, I won't say the culmination, because that suggests nothing comes next, and biologists don't know that, but are viewed as the apex of that. So then, lastly for this, really? I mean, really that simple? Everybody agrees that, wow, we're this apex of this major transition. There's some debate over that. And it's somewhat complicated for the following reasons. We do have these things: specialization of labor, information change, and cooperative interdependence at a scale nobody else has. But we don't have this one. We don't have relinquishment of reproductive autonomy. So if you're a cell in a body, you've lost yourself. We're not cells in a body. We still have ourselves, and we're called by the gospel to give ourselves, but it's a choice, and we can give them or not give them. So it's, in a sense, like we're stuck in a transition. We have all these things, but we haven't relinquished reproductive autonomy. And E.O. Wilson claimed this. He says, man has achieved an extraordinary degree of cooperation with little or no sacrifice of personal survival and reproduction. Exactly how he alone has been able to cross this pinnacle is the culminating mystery of all biology. I don't think he knows, but he's just reflecting millennia of Christian thought in terms of, well, Alexander Pope placed on this isthmus of a middle state of being darkly wise and rudely great. And Pascal says, man is neither angel nor brute. We're not just an animal, but we're not an angel either. And he goes on to say, I might expect him to say, and he who thinks he's an animal is going to behave like one. He actually says the opposite. And the unfortunate thing is, he who would act the angel acts the brute. If we have too Gnostic or disembodied notion of who we are and what we can achieve, we're going to be vulnerable to what Paul calls the flesh. So now here's the question. How did we make this jump? Well, first of all, there's some cognitive enhancements or mechanisms. Now remember, I began with saying, I'm just going to look at the empirical, and I'm going to let smarter people like Justin Barrett look at cognitive enhancements, because I don't know how to figure out what's going on in an animal's mind, but he may talk about things like collective intentionality, that I can think of not just I and you, but we, and form joint intentions. I do want to mention one thing, only because Darwin himself weighed in on this. Remember the quote from de Waal that says, human beings have no basic wants or needs that our closest relatives don't also share. Well, the developmental psychologist Jerome Kagan at Harvard challenged him on this. Oops. De Waal concedes that he said, have you ever seen a guilty chimp? And de Waal says, no, actually. And Kagan says, de Waal concedes that he has never seen a guilty chimp, and he never will. Because guilt requires an agent to know simultaneously that a voluntary act has hurt another and that he could have chosen otherwise. In other words, it entails the notion to think counterfactually. I did something, I remember what I did, and I could have done different. And interestingly, Darwin says the same thing. A moral being is one who is capable of comparing his past and future actions or motives and of approving or disapproving them. We have no reason to suppose that any of the lower animals have this capacity. So what does that mean? I do want to look at the behavior. And here are, I may be a little ahead of time. Where are we on? Oh, we're doing, okay. A really influential book called The Biology of Moral Systems by Richard Alexander proposed that one of the things that morality does in extending the domain of human behavior is that it enables us, even if we don't know somebody, to know something about them by their reputation for living up to moral norms. So he proposed the notion of indirect reciprocity. I might help Justin because he helped me. But what if Justin doesn't help me back? I might help him otherwise because then he thinks I'm a good guy and he tells Ken I'm a good guy and Ken helps me. That's indirect reciprocity. So let me give you an example of this. What if I tell you that I'm going to give you the opportunity to enter a contest where you get $1 million, but in order to enter, you have to pay me $1,000. And I'll give you one other option. In addition to giving me $1,000 and by the way, the contest is taking a graduate level exam in evolutionary theory. Pay me $1,000. If you pass, you get $1 million. But I tell you one other thing. If you want to, you can pay this guy $1,000 to take the exam for you. Are you going to do it? I wouldn't. Who is that guy? Well, who he is David Haig of the Department of Organismic and Evolutionary Biology at Harvard. I would now. And the reason I bring this up is because David has this fun little phrase. He says, direct reciprocity takes a face. So if you're going to do that, you have to at least be sufficiently cognitively developed to recognize individuals and remember them. But indirect reciprocity takes a name. No question, humans are extraordinary. We're the only ones that name each other and pass along information about the named. That's a difference in kind. And looking at this, again, Encephalization says, human societies represent a spectacular outlier with respect to all other animal species because they're based on large-scale cooperation amongst genuinely unrelated individuals. Indirect reciprocity and moral norms again. Okay, almost there. There are limitations. First of all, if morality just involves the norms by which our reputations are mediated, and by the way, there's no question that that's true. Proverbs says a good name is more to be desired than gold. I mean, we do, but if that's all it is, then all we get is virtue signaling. And Pharisaical morality, which Jesus stringently challenged. You do your good before other men to be seen. So that's not going to generate true goodness. And by the way, it's vulnerable to defection whenever you think that violating social norms will not be detected, if that's all it is. And I don't think it is all it is, but it's there as I look inside myself. But what if it's more than that? What if it's commitment to a genuine good that you believe transcends your own reward and punishment? Well, then we have this problem. The good that I would do, I don't do. And the bad that I don't want to do, I do. There is a human fracture where even if we believe that something is a normative end, we're not naturally disposed to always do it. And that's where current theories of religion come in. So, current theories, first of all, address moralizing gods as conscience supplementing. In areas where our conscience lets us down, because maybe I can do this bad and get away with it. No, I can't. There's an omniscient God, and you don't get away with anything. It may supplement conscience. Or it may supplement it in other ways, that if you want to do a good and don't think you can do it, then Hebrews says, for the joy set before him, Jesus enjoyed the cross. There's nothing selfish about that. That's recognizing the appropriate end of human existence. There's an explosion of recent work on this. So going back really to Voltaire, who said, if God did not exist, it would be necessary to invent him. So I'll just give you a couple of snapshots. An influential paper published in Science a while back, The Origin and Evolution of Religious Prosociality. And there's a bunch of experimental work that demonstrates when people are primed with religious primes, they give more in behavioral economic transfer experiments. There's work by my colleague Rich Sosis on just looking at commune longevity and whether they're religious or non-religious communes. There's a tremendous amount of work on religious commitment and volunteerism. Now, by the way, some of this is flawed because it involves what's called cohort studies. And maybe you give more if your church attendance is higher just because you're healthier. And if you're unhealthy, you don't go to church, you don't give. But anyways, that's where there's some longitudinal studies that have just come out that confirm this. And then there are a number of books that have argued that the emergence of not animistic or polytheistic religions, but the emergence of monotheistic religions with moralizing gods who are interested in human behavior correspond to and were necessary to the emergence of large-scale human cooperativity. I would have never expected to see this when I was a grad student in evolutionary biology. And fascinating thing is, when I was a grad student, Richard Dawkins was around, he still is, but Dawkins' notion, religion is a virus more deadly than the smallpox, but more difficult to eradicate. This notion of religion being a pathogenic virus, and by the way, there's no question that there can be negative and ugly aspects of religious commitment as well, that has very much turned around. In fact, one of the early advocates of this, Susan Blackmore, published a recent popular article, Why I No Longer Believe Religion is a Virus of the Mind. I was wrong, and the idea of religions as viruses of the mind have had their day. He would not agree with the context that I'm quoting him, but Dan Dennett affirms the fact that humans, in response to what he calls creeds, well, we have the built-in desire to reproduce and do pretty much whatever it takes to achieve this goal, but we also have creeds and the ability to transcend our genetic imperatives. This fact does make it different. Interestingly, where much of the biosciences have come is that at one point we used to say ideas are consequences. They're consequences of synapse and structural forces in evolution. And now we're back to saying, no, ideas have consequences, that we're not reducible to genetic self-interest. Lastly, so conscience supplementing. But as a Christian, I think, and I'm hope for more research in this area, religion and religious commitment may go beyond conscience. In fact, I think now of Paul's comments that we're not under the law, we're under something else. It's not just a matter of obeying a list of do's and don'ts. And how is religion, how are we beyond conscience? Beyond divine reward and punishment. There's some work on Holocaust rescuers, by the way. There's significant differences in religious commitment between those who did and didn't. But a number of different studies indicate that, first of all, there was no moral assessment. It's not what's the right thing to do here. It was absolutely instinctive that there's no other choice I can make. And that no other choice I can make had to do with this notion of profoundly shared humanity. And the New Testament tells us that we comfort others with the comfort that we receive. This isn't about conscience or do and don't. And Paul says we love others because he first loved us. So and gratitude itself is a wellspring of benevolence to others. So I think many of us have experienced that firsthand. I know I certainly had since my drug-dealing surf bum days in Hawaii. My own life was that experience was a presence of a love in my life that I could not even have imagined. And it freed me to care about others in a way that I also couldn't have imagined. But we need more systematic research on this. So concluding comments. Well, first of all, there are a lot of areas of consonance between where current biological thinking is going and where Christians have always been. Human exceptionalism. Now, image of God isn't located in capacities, but there are exceptional capacities. And I may get pushback on this, but at least within a current biological thinking, the ultimate distinctive is this radical capacity to care about others when it's not necessarily compensatory. I think it represents a turnaround from Enlightenment thinking that viewed the distinctive of humans as rationality, which maybe goes all the way back to Aristotle, but that may be distinctive. But what's empirically observable is this telos of love. There's a trajectory over the history of creation that embodies this notion of gain through relinquishment. It really is more blessed to give than to receive, even at the cellular level. I don't want to get saccharine here, because with every level of increasing interdependence and cooperation, there are new levels and opportunities for defection. So you have cells cooperating with each other, and you can have a cell saying, not for me, and that's called cancer. But there is this trajectory of gain through relinquishment. And then humans are in a middle state where there's debate. Are we a transition? If we are, is it completed? Looks like not. And finally, religion plays a crucial role in this. And closing with some cautions. First of all, some of these ideas are contested. We're not at the heliocentric versus geocentric theory of the solar system stage. These are ideas that are on the table, widely accepted and contested. And secondly, this notion of particularly moral gods and large-scale social organization. There's debate now whether the large-scale social organization with kings gave rise to the notion of a kingship deity rather than opposing polytheistic deities, or whether those commitments themselves were necessary to the rise of large-scale societies. My own read of the literature, just empirically, is that the latter has more going for it. Secondly, boy, I would love, Justin Barrett has mentioned this before. I don't know if he's doing anything on it yet, but all these theories are religiously undiscriminating, meaning that they're not looking at different religious traditions and different beliefs about God to see whether there are differential effects. And lastly, semi-lastly, they're morally ambiguous. So yes, religion increases the scale and the depth of cooperation. But we have 9/11, and we have the religiously embedded biological racism of slavery. So religion oftentimes can cement in-group commitment at the expense of out-group hostility. And here's where the message of Christ, I think, is especially relevant and especially radical. Love your enemies. Bless those who curse you. Pray for those who despitefully use you. That's an outlier, for sure. And lastly, I would say that all these things are consonant of what I believe the scriptures teach about the nature of humankind and the telos, the ultimate end of human existence, but they're not demonstrative. This isn't natural theology trying to prove these claims. This is just observations of the natural world that are consonant with them. So I'll close, speaking of natural theology, I'll close with a comment by Pascal. The God of Christians is not a God who is simply the author of mathematical truths or the author of the elements. He's not merely a God who exercises his providence over the life and fortunes of man. The God of Christians is a God of love and comfort, a God who fills the soul and heart of those whom he possesses, a God who makes them conscious of their inward waywardness and his infinite mercy, who unites himself with their inmost soul, who fills it with humility and joy, confidence and love, and who renders them incapable of any other end than himself. Thank you, Lord, and amen.
Looking forward to hearing your answers, Dr. Schloss. Thank you so much again. I always enjoy hearing Jeff. Jeff and I do go a long way back, and I do appreciate so many things about Jeff. One is the gracious way he comes into the lion's den, because he realizes that he is speaking at a Southern Baptist seminary in which probably almost everything you said is a minority position here within Southern Baptist life. In fact, that's the very first question. This is the SBC, where perhaps many, maybe most, are not convinced about human evolution at all. So why should your message matter to the Christians that reject evolution in toto?
Well, I said from the start, this was not a talk to persuade anybody that evolution is true. What it was is a talk to raise the question, if it were true, what would the implications be? Now, some things I didn't get at. So, for example, one of the implications, and this is one I myself wrestle with, and we had this discussed in one of the earlier sessions, is what does the fall mean? We were created one way. As a Christian, I believe something happened. It's not just that things have been progressing. So I think that's a big deal. And so I will confess to wrestling with that myself. There are other issues, the age of the earth, who were Adam and Eve, when were they? I recommend Josh Swamindass's work for some of that. But again, my goal here was just to, I guess, debunk the nihilistic misrepresentations of evolutionary theory. I want Christians to know, maybe some things you can't live with theologically, but a number of the other supposedly theological contradictions involve misrepresentations of evolutionary theory, and I think actually further erode Christians' confidence in science. If you got scientists claiming all this crazy stuff, like evolution, Darwin means there's no such thing as moral reality, well, then it would make sense to throw it out.
Well, so one of the questions that follow up with that, there are those who say, how do you view the various creation scientist groups and their impact on Christianity in the public square? Helpful, harmful? Go ahead, jump right in there.
Well, I'll be candid. I think the greatest.
I knew you would.
I think the greatest single determinant of helpful or hurtful is rhetorical posture and graciousness.
Yeah.
So my colleagues at Reason to Believe, who identify as old Earth creationists,
and I'm a fellow with them.
and you are,
Yeah.
I disagree with them, and I view them as the fragrance of Christ in the marketplace. I have never heard them do personal attack, call somebody evil, anti-gospel, or stupid. And actually, I'll just share, as part of my earlier affiliation with BioLogos, which is not as significant as it was at one time, we got together with Hugh and Foz. We spent a weekend together, just sharing our lives in Christ. And then that set up another weekend together. And then my mom dies, and I get a bereavement card from them. That's the issue. What's your posture? Are you a fragrance in Christ? And I think they are. I'll be honest about this.
Okay, go ahead.
I don't see that in the major young earth organizations, and I don't see it in the major nucleus of the intelligent design movement in terms of the fragrance of Christ versus the culture warrior mentality.
Yeah. We have a number of people here. Two of our guests are Dr. Joshua Swamidas and Dr. Nathan Lentz. We're going to hear more from them tonight, fellows, but Dr. Lentz is also a biologist. He's a secular biologist, and he is politely chomping at the bit. Would you like to ask one question, Nathan? We will hear more from Nathan tonight at 7, but why don't you ask one of the questions now that you'd have? Yes, you project it. I'll repeat it.
By the way, I love your presentation very much. I even learned a lot myself, and there's a lot to celebrate. And thank you all for having me in your space. So I had a question. When you talked about how one theory about the evolution of morality and why we treat people well even when they are in no position to reciprocate, or just sort of altruism, pure altruism. The way that evolutionary biologists think about this a lot is between kin selection, but also this idea of reputation and what goes around comes around, and we evolve in small groups. But you mentioned this human capacity we have to sort of love somebody who could never possibly help us. A homeless person, if you give him $1, you're never going to get that $1 back. So what would you say to the supposition that, but that's part of our wiring, is to give us the illusion that we act as though. So for example, and you might be familiar with Bob Triver's work on self-delusion.
Yeah.
The best liars are the people who believe the lie, right? So our ability to convince ourselves that something is not true allowed us to manipulate other people. Now that's kind of a dark triad quality, but you spin that in a positive way. Our ability to love without regard to the cost is part of that illusion too that we come with. Is if we help, if we care about our reputation, we care about our family members, you just keep going with that. You end up with this reality of, I don't care if you can ever help me back. I'll be a good person. I'll accomplish all of those things if I'm not trying to calculate who can pay me back.
Yeah. Great question. I culled my talk for time, but that would have been a next step. So let me elaborate that on a little bit. So Alexander's theory of morality and indirect reciprocity is actually at root pretty cynical. He says that morality is the currency in our reputational bank account. And conscience goes off every time the capital threatens to be eroded. So according to Alexander and indirect reciprocity, we should cheat anytime we can get away with it. And then a number of economists have said, well, but that's not how it works. People tip in out-of-town restaurants where they'll never see the person again and where nobody will ever know. So that's part of what you're getting at. So now there's stage 2. And there's this theory of reliable, costly, or hard-to-fake signaling. And there's a bunch of work that suggests, I get excited, so I got to stand up.
Go ahead.
That says every time we do something like that, it's actually ingrained in us temperamentally, and it provokes facial habituated gestures and other things that signal to people whether we're other concerned or not. And there's been a bunch of research on this, by the way. One of my favorite studies is University of Michigan. They brought people in, they had them read Little Red Riding Hood into a video recorder, then they had them keep a log of what they did over the next month. And in that log, they extracted homeless ministries or visiting people in jail, and then they played these movies to introductory psychology students, and they had them rank them in terms of their altruism just based on their facial expressions reading Little Red Riding Hood, and bingo, they nailed it. So that step is hard-to-fake signaling. And then your suggestion of Triver's, and Bob and I have talked a lot about this, is that, well, shoot, that's great if you tip in an out-of-town restaurant, but even better would be, these are hard-to-fake signals. So if you're lying, it's not going to work. But if you lie to yourself, it will work. If you think you're a great benevolent person, even though you never do, that will come through. So that's kind of the terminus as you raise. But now the question is, and this is a tough empirical and large-scale question. That theory still says that in terms of our actual behavior, and there can be outliers, but in terms of typical human behavior, we shouldn't routinely help others where there isn't some sort of compensatory benefit. And the question is, do we? And I mentioned at the close, this is debated, but a lot of my colleagues think, yes, we do. That, and it's not an outlier. Boy, as a Christian, I would say we do it far too rarely. But it looks like humans do it. Great question.
Thank you, Dr. Lenz. I listen to this dialogue and conversation, and it's fascinating, the hypotheses, the models, the theories, and I'm thinking, okay, is there anywhere empirically that you're finding this, say, genetically? In other words, what kind of empirical scientific evidence is being found? I mean, at what point are these just so stories?
Well, just so stories was a phrase developed by Stephen Gould to criticize what he called Darwinian fundamentalism, which was the inclination to kind of post-dictively impose adaptive benefit, and you can dream up a story for anything. This is actually the opposite of a just so story. I'm not ascribing any reproductive benefit. I'm just saying we have these behaviors, and in fact, the Darwinian reductionistic account of things doesn't seem to entirely work here. So first of all, I'd say opposite of a just so story. Secondly, though, Christians aren't Gnostics. They don't believe that the ultimate goodness or telos of human beings doesn't have anything to do with our bodies. So the question of, are there genetic or neurophysiologically or hormonal mediations of these behaviors, independent of the fitness questions? Well, that is being looked into. And I'll share a multi-year study that we've been doing at Westmont. We've been bringing folks in and having them do different group activities, singing together, worshiping, playing a board game, sitting silent. We measure oxytocin levels before and after, and then we have them play economic transfer experiments. And it turns out that active corporate activities, like playing a game together or singing or worship, boosts oxytocin and boosts cooperation more than just sitting together. But worship does the most.
Excellent. I'm glad to hear that.
But not in the Baptist tradition.
Excellent. There you go.